Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is lecture number 18, where we will be talking about qualitative research methods in gender studies. Let me quickly remind you of what we talked about research methods in the last lecture. So we talked about quantitative research methods, particularly with respect to gender studies, and we did talk about that some of the basic stages of doing quantitative research, and then some ideas connecting theory and theoretical concepts with the idea of quantitative research principles, particularly when we deal with categories such as gender. So we closed with an idea that gender has evolved as an analytical category over the decades, and there are certain challenges and certain positive points of using quantitative research to understand gender. And in this lecture we will see that what are some of the qualitative research principles and some of the qualitative research methods that we can actually use to understand gender. So the key questions that we will be asking here is, what is qualitative research, and what is the role of theory building in qualitative research? As I kept on saying in the last lecture, as I say now, that there is a very important connection between theory building and data collection. So we would explore some of that relationship between theory and data again now by looking at qualitative data. So just to give you a basic idea of these stages that one would come across in a qualitative research method is we're still talking about documentation of the data. We're talking about data collection, and there are various ways that we are collecting data for qualitative research. For quantitative, we looked at how surveys often turn out to be one of the effective ways. For qualitative research, we will see how and why interviews are the recommended ways. Next, we need to understand that we are dealing with concepts here. So how do we conceptualize something? So what is the process of conceptualization, and then how do we qualitatively code our data and categorize that data? So we need to understand the relationships in the data to show how one concept may be influencing another. So there are some very, very important and significant ways of qualitative data analysis that are emerging, and they help us to see the relationship between these qualitative concepts, and then how one actually links with the other, and how can we establish an understanding of networks of these concepts. The third point here is authenticating conclusions by evaluating alternative explanations. So as I said previously also, that when we are reporting a data, we need to also state that whatever we are reporting is valid, is authentic, and is reliable. And so by evaluating alternative explanation. So, this is something called a data triangulation, that you are drawing your data from at least 3 different sources, including primary and secondary sources, and this is just giving a vantage point for a researcher to look at these alternative explanations or alternative sources to actually make meaning of your conclusion. And of course, the idea of reflexivity that go hand in hand with understanding the social contexts, how concept is constructed, and so on. So, we see that the birth of qualitative research has a distinct history, and we see that historically qualitative methods have been used as ethnographic methods. If we go back to some of the significant studies that was done by the Chicago School, particularly with regard to understanding or developing urban models, in a post-industrial society with change in residential patterns, change in zones within an urban settlement. So, the drafting, the building of these early urban models, as we understand by the Chicago School, was one of the earlier ventures, one of the pioneer ventures to actually understand society ethnographically. And immigration is the next idea, which gives us some of the classic examples of ethnographic work, again in the US context, and we see some of the earlier works such as the Polish Peasant in Europe and America, published in 1918. They form some of the earlier classic qualitative research, particularly with an ethnographic focus. So, we see that prior to the 1990s, most social science research was conducted following natural science methods, which means that most of this research focused on experimental design, statistical analysis, that is to understand social processes in an objective manner, going back to the object subject debate, that most of this earlier, this pre 1990s type of research that attempted to do qualitative research were actually based on these methods of experimental design and statistical analysis. And we see a methodological revolution in the 1980s and 1990s, where we see that qualitative research emerged as a scientific understanding of humans and society. So, we see that there is an emergence, there is a birth of an idea where it is understood that humans and society, they are not single entity, they are dependent on each other, and this is a organic relationship that evolves over time. And so, for any research on the humans and society, it calls for the requirement of an open mind, a critical yet open mind, and this is the methodological revolution that we see happening around the 1980s and the 1990s. So, in the 2000, we see scholars such as Denson and Lincoln actually talk about that a quiet methodological revolution has been occurring in the social sciences. A blurring of disciplinary boundaries was taking place. The social sciences and humanities were drawing closer together in a mutual focus on an interpretive, qualitative approach to research and theory. So, we see that scholars now are consciously studying or are consciously trying to understand why or some of the historical causations of this methodological revolution, the so called revolution of qualitative research, and what happened behind the scenes for this methodological revolution. And we see that it's no longer a silent revolution, as Denson and Lincoln called it, that we see, you know, journals exclusively dedicated to qualitative research. So there are journals who publish research that are, you know, purely qualitative in nature. We see that researchers have more and more you know, adopted lenses of seeing the world through our filters. So as social science researchers, we use you know, our filters or our understanding of the social world to conduct research. And the precision of identifying the filters to collect, view, analyze and report the data. And this is where the scientific approach to you know, research design comes in, is to make a conscious effort of, you know, understanding and identifying these filters, view, analyze and report the data, and this is called a researcher's positionality. So all researchers, you know, most researchers, if not all actually, they have their own research positions, and it is important, and this is another way to understand the filters, is to understand what is the researcher's positionality. So where is the researcher herself or himself located, you know, in society, and from what vantage point is this research being conducted. So for example, if you have say a particular research being done say on a phenomena involving gender, and the phenomena remaining unchanged, researcher A and researcher B may have different takes or approaches to do the same sort of research depending on their respective social positioning. So it is important that not just you know, as researchers, social science researchers, we should be mindful for our filters, but we should also acknowledge you know, the social positionalities, the social positions that one has in society. So we have seen that over time qualitative research has been used in a variety of disciplines. So today we see that qualitative research is a way to answer questions that is no longer, you know, a new idea. So it has become one of the legitimate ways of scientifically working for a social science research, and we see, you know, a huge application, a significant application of you know, qualitative research in disciplines such as journalism, social studies, urban studies, behavioral sciences and health studies. So more and more we are getting towards a research methods paradigm where you know, qualitative research is becoming one of the most you know, significant ways of looking at patterns and behaviors, particularly across these disciplines. So some of the examples of data collection and analysis in this respect for qualitative research. So if you can remember, you know, in the previous lecture we talked about the 3 phases of you know, research. So we have a research design, you know, so where we ask you know, the research question, we think about the types of you know, sample that we want to investigate, and then the types of data that we want to collect. Depending on that, we design the you know, data collection tools, the protocols, and then depending on the nature of data collection, we decide on how do we want to analyze that particular data. So here when we talk particularly in terms of qualitative research, there is something called the grounded theory approach, which is one of the very you know, popular and significant theoretical premises on which qualitative research rests. And very similar to that is the idea of the constant comparison approach. So we will take a look at what grounded theory approach is later on in this lecture. But for now, let me introduce you to some of the data collection techniques of qualitative research, starting with interviews, as we have talked about that being able to be there present in person and talking to a person, taking taking down notes, asking questions, probably is one of the most significant ways of eliciting, of taking down data from a research subject. The next very popular effective way of doing qualitative research is participant observation. So you become a participant in any say social phenomena, or any sort of events or festivals where you want to see how people are negotiating gender relations between themselves. So you become a part of that event and as a participant observer, and that is one way, and you take down your notes from what you observe. So those become your sources of data. The third form of data collection that you can have is from focus groups, as we talked about last lecture also, where you have a group of people who share the same experiences or the same phenomena, and to have them in a single place and have them discuss about that process is an effective way of collecting qualitative data. The third, the fourth and the fifth one, content analysis and narrative analysis, actually may come from your secondary sources of data, where you look at particularly content analysis, where you look at existing research that has already been done, or data that is already available, whether it's from a website or from books, or data that is already published, and data that is already available. So you draw from, those are called secondary sources of data. So you draw from the secondary sources of data and you analyze the content. So in a way, this is a way that you can do content analysis. So coming to data analysis for qualitative research, there are various ways, and there are these significant stages in which you can analyze qualitative data. So as social scientists, remember the first few lectures where I talked about that one of the major goals for us as social scientists is to look for patterns, is to look for social patterns, what are the various similarities or departures. So one of the starting points for us to look here is to identify patterns and themes. So what are the recurring patterns that you are seeing in the data? What are the recurring themes that are coming out from that data? Depending on what you find out, you do you can do a very basic level of coding, of qualitative coding as we understand it, and this basic coding and the next stage, the advanced coding, can be done using very sophisticated software which are there in the market. They are all licensed software, and I highly recommend that you can use one or more of those software if it helps. You start by transforming these themes into codes, into qualitative codes, and we'll see in a minute how what are some of the principles that guides coding. And then there are ways of doing autoethnography or life histories, and doing visual research, that when you look at something, say a picture, or you look at a cinema, and then you try to analyze visually, or you want to report your analysis in a visual manner. So these are the very fundamental ways in which qualitative research can be collected, qualitative data can be collected, and qualitative data analysis can be done. So, having looked at some of the fundamental ways in which how qualitative data can be collected and analyzed, we can now look at some of the fundamental points of comparison, as we also had seen in the previous lecture, that if we have to compare qualitative with a quantitative method, so we see that there can be adopted a middle approach or the mixed methods research. And this is increasingly becoming important and a significant way of doing research in social sciences, to adopt a mixed method research. And if you do conversation analysis, or engage in understanding the subjectivity, if you recall the object subject debate and the power arrangements that it talks about, then we need to look at the balance, the knowledge of reality, the discernment of plurality and articulation, particularly when we are analyzing a conversation, particularly when we are analyzing data that is reported through an intensive interview. So, we see that there is an evolution of a creative interdisciplinary combination of both qualitative and quantitative approaches. So, over time what has happened is the qualitative quantitative divide is kind of blurred as more and more scholars are adopting mixed method approach. So, it is emerging to be an interdisciplinary way of combining methods that are both qualitative and quantitative. So, having said that, let us now try to understand then what is qualitative research. So, some of the guiding questions or the fundamental questions that we need to ask at the start of any qualitative research is the 5 W's, or who, what, when, where and why, and or how is being studied. So, if you are drafting a research question, or if you are drafting a research problem, a problem statement, then you should be careful to identify that do you have the who, what, when, where and why or how in that research problem statement. Is it reflected in that research problem statement? If it is not, then you probably need to go back and refine it and make all of these visible in the research problem statement. So, these 5 W's and the how can be reflected at various scales of human, cultural, social interactions. So, so again, depending on the unit of analysis that you choose, the how can be reflected at various scales of human, cultural, social interactions. So, so again, depending on the unit of analysis that you choose to take for this particular research that you want to do. Of course, for a qualitative researcher, naturally occurring settings are very important. So, where would you like to conduct this study to take for this particular research that you want to do? Of course, for a qualitative researcher, naturally occurring settings are very important. So, where would you like to conduct this study? Science researcher in making meaning of what you are collecting. So, the data collection, what sort of meaning are you generating from that data collection, and of course, the type of data that you collect. So, are you going to collect heavily heavily quantitative data or heavily qualitative data or a mix of both is your call as a researcher. So, qualitative research has evolved as a way to study the social interactions of humans in naturally occurring situations. So, the research plays a crucial role in the process by gathering data and making sense of or interpreting the phenomena that are observed and revealed. So, the role of the researcher, again, to emphasize, becomes increasingly important, not just in the gathering of data, but also interpreting and observing that data. So, then the question is, what makes research qualitative? And we see that the more we focus on individuals and groups and the worlds in which they live and work, we tend to understand again their experiences, their lived experiences in the social contexts, and this focus on whether it's individual or whether on groups, this focus in understanding the social context of a person or a group of people is one of these starting points to making something or making a research qualitative. So, individuals in their natural settings, not as part of any experiment. So, we look at individuals in their social setting, but not as part of any experiment, objective experiment. Researchers' role in gathering and interpreting data that I talked about, and finally the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity, the transition. So, the basic elements of qualitative research, as we understand, is not just to understand the the what and the why of human behavior, but also to understand them in their natural setting, using an inductive inductive approach, starting from understanding data and then through empirical generalization to going towards theory building, and using themes and narratives as understanding meanings in the data. So, we have seen that we have significant theorists who have talked or have used quantitative research, and some of the classic theorists, starting with Habermas in 1929, he was born in 1929, who actually employed these techniques, qualitative techniques, to the understanding of the public sphere, and he employed it to the understanding of class based communication. So, that is one of the significant places where we see and use and employment of qualitative methods. We see in the work of Bourdieu, who actually talked about class construction again with regard to power and the society, and it's a classic qualitative way of understanding class construction using power negotiations in society. And finally, we see the works of Foucault, where we see that there has been a lot of conversation around power and knowledge, and the questions that are asked in this respect, that how are we constituted as subjects of our own knowledge, how are we constituted as subjects who exercise or submit to power relations, and how are we constituted as moral subjects of our own actions. So, not just a qualitative understanding of knowledge production, but also the role that power and knowledge share, the relationship between power and knowledge. To give you an idea of what forms do qualitative data come in, we have looked at the ideas of texts, and that it comes mostly in the form of words and descriptions, but there are other sources of which generate qualitative data, and these can be material objects, these can be images, either they are still images or moving images, and these can be sounds. So, as you can see that the data can be drawn from various sources if we want to analyze them qualitatively. So, we have seen that depending on the type of question that we wish to ask for any given research, there can be various types of research done. So, there can be descriptive research, there can be exploratory research, there can be comparative research. So, again it depends, it's heavily driven by the types of questions that is asked of in a particular research. Next, if we look at some of the techniques for producing qualitative data, we see that I talked about interviews. So, here it shows up as the elicitation techniques. So, interviews can form a range between from unstructured to semi-structured to structured to mixed types of interviews. So, what type of question are you asking in an interview protocol? Whether it's completely open ended, whether it's semi structured or structured, or it's a mix of all of these, will define, will render character to the type of research that you are doing. So, the kind of elicitation technique, so the kind of questions you ask a person in person matters with regard to the type of questions. I talked about observation. So, on the left hand side you can see indirect observation and direct observation. So, participant observation or full observation depends on how you are doing the observation study. So, it can be an indirect observation where you do not really participate in the process, and it can be a direct observation where you are continuously monitoring or you're on spot observing certain phenomena. And then on the extreme right hand side you can see mixed methods, as I was talking about, which is an emerging way of doing research in social sciences, that case studies and participant observation are becoming new ways or mixed methods ways of understanding the data. So, if I have to draw another way of understanding this, so we see that for an type of elicitation or in-depth interviews, we see that we have all these types or ways in which data can be collected using interview protocols. So, on the left hand side you see unstructured type of a protocol, which is informal or causal and ethnographic. So, it is completely unstructured, it is not really guided by close ended questions, and you just go out to the field to find out an in-depth understanding of a process, a social process or a phenomena. Now, the semi-structured and the structured types of elicitation that you can see here, they can, the questions in that protocol can be open-ended or close-ended depending on the nature of study that you want to do. And then for a structured type of an elicitation technique, you can have survey questionnaires, or you can have domain elicitation. So, you can have all these various types of techniques or types of elicitation processes depending on the nature of the questions that you are asking in the protocol. And of course, on the right and most side you see the mixed methods of elicitation, which is the it includes the ethnographic decision model. So, this is a range of ways, as you can see, in which you can actually design your interview protocol. Now, I want you to take a look at this list here and this continuum that you see at the end of the list, that which of these, so on one end of the continuum you have extremely positivistic ideas, and on the other end you have extremely interpretive ideas. So, take a look at this list of list, and then sort if each of these are addressing individuals or groups. And so, this is an exercise I want you to do as you are moving through this lecture, that you sort this list that you see by addressing if they are individuals or can be conducted in groups. So, now you have a fair idea of the how the types of data that you can have, whether you want to use a qualitative or a quantitative research method. And here I want to introduce you to one of the very significant theoretical premises of qualitative data, which is called grounded theory. And there are some classic works done in or on grounded theory by Glaser and Strauss, by Corbin and Strauss, Saldana, and then I'll walk you through what some of these works look like. But to start with, we see that grounded theory, if we adopt a grounded theory approach, we start with something to research, emphasize inductive over deductive patterns of recognition. So, that is one of the starting points of understanding grounded theory, that you start with data, that you start with an inductive approach. Then you start collecting some data, a little amount of data, analyze using constant comparison method. You do a first round of memoing, and then you code that data into conceptual maps and diagrams. So, it's a very logical sequence that you follow when you are starting to analyze that data. And then, as I said, you identify patterns in that data, and you go back to existing literature using the principles of theoretical sampling to see that if you need to collect more data. So, there is a background literature to all research, and you read up this background literature, and from that from what you have done as a theoretical sampling from that existing work, if you need to collect more data, then you bring in more data. And then you analyze the data using memos and looking for emerging patterns or emerging themes or categories. So, in a way you derive at these core concepts using these logical stages grounded theory, and then what you have in the end is a relationship between some of these codes, some of these concepts that you have derived, which inform, which contribute to the existing theory that you have been working with. So, here on the screen you can see the cyclical manner in which grounded theory approach can be adopted. You see that if you start with data collection and then you have analysis questions and data collection again and then analysis questions again. So, you see that this is a way of doing theoretical sampling or theoretical or employing theoretical sampling to grounded theory, and it's a very iterative process. It's a very repetitive process. So, you do the same thing over and over again until you reach something called data saturation. So, this is one of the ways where you start talking about grounded theory. Now, the idea of grounded theory as a methodology has been dealt with by several scholars over the years, and what has produced as a result of that ongoing conversation is multiple versions of grounded theory. So, here as you can see that we have at least 3 versions of grounded theory. The Glazerian version, which is Glaser and Strauss's 1967 version and Glaser's 1978 version. The Straussian version, which is Strauss and Corbin's 1990 version, and the constructivist grounded theory, which is Sharma's 2004 version. So, now let us look at each one of these versions, what each one say. So, the first the version the first version, the Glazerian model, talks about qualitative research not just exclusively by itself, but also about any methodology including quantitative ways of doing research. So, it talks about this variety of methods, and it is less formalized than the next model that we will see, the Straussian model. And there is a whole lot of theoretical sensitivity that is factored in the Glazerian model, that is it's heavily based on the existing theoretical samples or theoretical sensitivity. So, it was one of the first versions that was proposed, and later on scholars have actually built on the Glazerian model. So, with that we have the second version of grounded theory, which is called the Straussian model, and the Straussian model, as you can see, pays a lot of attention to how you analyze a particular data set. So, it talks a lot about coding, about qualitative coding. So, it talks about open coding as a constant comparison method, where you can code events, actions, interactions between people. You develop concepts from that data, you ask questions to your data, and you attach some sort of precisions to these codes, and you minimize assumptions. So, this is called open coding according to the Straussian model. Now, the next step, once you have done the basic level of, or the primary level of coding, the next step of coding would be what is called as axial coding. In axial coding, what you do is you link these concepts. So, you by the time you have done open coding, you have arrived at some of these various concepts. You have conceptualized some of these ideas that come from the data, and then in axial coding you actually establish relationship between these concepts. So, you link these concepts with one another. So, you have conditions, you have contexts, you have interactions, and you have symbolic interaction. So, there are these various ways in which you actually can link concepts. And then finally, for selective coding, you have core and subcategories. So, if you can and this is purely with reference to how software, the qualitative analysis software have developed, that you can actually see a code tree. You can actually see a hierarchical manner in which the core and the subcategories of the core codes are actually nested under one another. So, that is one way of doing selective coding. So, as you can see, the Straussian model paid a lot of emphasis on what you do once you have the data, once you have collected that data. The next or the third model that you see here is the constructivist grounded theory model, which was proposed by Sharma in 2004. And for the first time in this model, do you see that the researcher along with the research subject is actually brought to the focus. So, we see that the researcher is a co-constructor of meaning during interaction. So, we see that when a researcher is interviewing or collecting data from the research subject, the meaning, that is the meanings that are coming out of that interaction, the researcher has a important role to play in constructing that meaning. So, for the first time we see that the spotlight is also on the researcher, and this is something we talked about the researcher's social location also, that it is also brought to focus. It more or less follows the Glaser and Strauss's model, but it is just more formalized in that respect by bringing in context and complexity and possibility for multiple meanings. So, the meanings that are generated, it can be so that there is a range of meanings that are being generated. So, just to keep all doors open, that the constructivist grounded theory model proposes that there is a possibility for multiple meaning. So, as you can see that the grounded theory idea, the principles of grounded theory has traveled over these decades, and each of these versions that you just saw actually brings with it its own vantage point. It brings with it its own significant emphasis. So, now if you can sum them up and if you can look at how Glaser and Strauss and Corbin and Sharma's idea actually compare with each other, you will see that for the first version, which talked about Glaser's version, theory should emerge by constant comparison, not forced. So, all theory building should be emergent, not forced out. And Strauss's Corbin's version talks about data analysis more particularly, and they talk about developing categories or making data analysis more prescriptive. And Sharma's idea talks about categories and theory as co-constructed by researcher and respondents, and introduces the role of the researcher and how experience is constructed and structured. So, we see that the process or the principles that grounded theory follow actually follow a bottom up approach. As you can see here, that the researcher starts with very low level concepts, very basic primary concepts, which are often called themes, which are often emerging as parts of patterns, and these low level concepts then become categories as the researcher analyzes that data and builds categories out of these low level concepts, and then these categories move towards the idea of core categories or codes, as is commonly understood in qualitative research, that it gives rise to more sophisticated versions of these categories, which are called the core categories or the codes. So, if you can imagine, you have a series of these codes, and from each code, if you can think of a process to actually establish connections between multiple codes, and then say 2 or 3 or 4 codes, they club together, they merge together to form one particular category, and or subcodes form one particular category, and then these particular categories again merge towards building the larger concepts, which again build or contribute towards assertions or theory, as you can see here, that there is a journey that this analysis process takes place, and it is therefore very important for us to understand at this point what is this relationship between theory and methods when we talk of categories such as gender. That now imagine to translate this type of a data analysis, this type of a research to conduct or in understanding a gender phenomena or a gender process in any given society, that as you can see from this slide, that how contextual, how society, any particular social context would be heavily working on this analysis process to give you your codes, your subcodes, your concepts or your assertions towards theory. So, having understood that how this analysis in terms of qualitative using qualitative principles in doing gender research would work out, let's now look at some of the techniques that you can employ in understanding or analyzing data using a qualitative classic qualitative approach. So, as based on Ryan Bernard's 2003 work, you can look for any of these parameters that you can see here on the screen. That do you look for word repetitions, that something that is being said over and over again by many people in a particular sample. So, you identify frequently used words, and these are called keywords in context, KWIC, quick. So, we see word repetitions and words that are in context that will help us understand as researchers in what context was the used. We see or we look for any indigenous categories that may come out of that data analysis, or in other words, is there anything, any concept or category that is emerging from that data that previous research has not reported. So, they get translated as codes or in vivo codes that are particularly specific to that particular social group or that particular society. You also look for metaphors and analogies, for transitions, for comparing and contrasting, linguistic connectors, missing data, and theory related material. So, particularly important here is to look out for missing data, that when somebody is saying something, what is not being said. So, what topics are avoided or what topics are consciously not talked about is also very important as a researcher to take note of. And of course, there are theory related material where you start your journey from is to understand what are some of the background literature that has already been published in this regard, and then what can you draw from that existing literature to make meaning of your data. So, to conclude with this lecture, we will end by asking a question that given the limitations of both quantitative and qualitative research approaches, how can you identify an optimum way in which gender can be evaluated in social contexts. So, keeping in mind that gender as and has evolved as an analytical category over time and space. So, now you're somewhat familiar with some of the quantitative and qualitative principles of doing research, and so what are some of the effective ways that can be adopted to understand gender in society. So, I want to conclude this lecture here, and in the next lecture I will take up gender research across the world. Thank you.